In a dramatic escalation of tensions between two of the world's largest democracies, the United States has imposed unprecedented sanctions on India in 2025, marking a shocking turn in what was once considered a strategic partnership. The Trump administration first imposed a 25% tariff on Indian goods on 1 August, later doubling it to 50% effective 27 August 2025, with additional threats of secondary sanctions. This aggressive stance has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles and raised fundamental questions about America's approach to its allies. The root of the crisis, the current sanctions crisis, didn't emerge in a vacuum. It stems from deep-seated frustrations within the Trump administration over India's continued engagement with Russia, despite the ongoing Ukraine conflict. The White House has confirmed that Trump's sanctions on India aim to pressure Russia to end the Ukraine war, revealing the complex web of geopolitical calculations driving American foreign policy. The friction centers on India's pragmatic approach to international relations, which has clashed with America's binary worldview of allies and adversaries. India has maintained its historical policy of strategic autonomy, refusing to completely sever ties with Russia despite intense Western pressure. This has included continued imports of Russian oil and participation in BRICS, moves that have increasingly frustrated Washington. The sanction mechanism revealed the most shocking aspect of America's sanctions regime against India lies in its scope and methodology. On October 30, 2024, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctioned 19 Indian companies and 2 Indian individuals under its Russia-related sanctions program. This marked a significant escalation from previous diplomatic pressure to concrete punitive measures. The sanctions operate under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, a 2017 law that requires sanctions on countries engaging in certain transactions with Iran, North Korea, and Russia. The law imposes sanctions on countries engaging in certain transactions with Iran, North Korea, and Russia, creating a legal framework that has ensnared India despite its status as a strategic partner. What makes these sanctions particularly controversial is their extraterritorial reach. The United States has essentially weaponized its financial system and the dominance of the dollar to coerce Indian companies into compliance with American foreign policy objectives, regardless of Indian national interests or sovereignty. India's strategic response faced with the threat of American financial isolation. India has not remained passive. India has successfully employed alternative currency mechanisms to prevent violation of these sanctions, using alternative currencies such as Ruble, euros, or dirhams to execute agreements and continue lucrative financial relationships. The most notable example of this financial innovation is the Rupee Rial mechanism developed with Iran, allowing India to continue payments for Iranian crude oil supply while circumventing dollar-based transactions. This represents a direct challenge to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency and highlights how America's aggressive use of sanctions is inadvertently accelerating de-dollarization efforts worldwide. India's response reveals a sophisticated understanding of financial warfare. By diversifying payment mechanisms and building alternative financial infrastructure, New Delhi has demonstrated that even close American partners are no longer willing to subordinate their national interests to Washington's global agenda. The historical context to understand the shocking nature of these sanctions, one must consider the historical trajectory of U.S.-India relations. For over 2 decades, both nations have built what was supposed to be a natural partnership based on shared democratic values and strategic interests, particularly in containing China's rise. The relationship reached its pinnacle during the Obama and Trump administration's first term, with landmark agreements on defense cooperation, nuclear energy, and technology transfer. The transformation from strategic partners to economic adversaries represents one of the most dramatic policy reversals in recent diplomatic history. India has historically and largely not supported sanctions imposed by individual countries, supporting instead United Nations sanctions. This principled stance, rooted in India's non-aligned heritage, has increasingly come into conflict with America's unilateral sanctions regime. The China factor. What makes America's sanctions on India particularly shocking is the timing and strategic context. With China posing the most significant long-term challenge to American global dominance, alienating India, the only country with the demographic and economic potential to serve as a counterweight, seems strategically counterproductive. If the administration's goal is to build resilient supply chains and maintain a strategic coalition capable of containing Chinese influence, then the current approach is unsustainable. This assessment from policy experts highlights the self-defeating nature of the current sanctions regime. By pushing India away through punitive measures, the United States risks driving New Delhi closer to Beijing and Moscow, potentially creating the very geopolitical alignment it seeks to prevent. The irony is palpable. In attempting to isolate Russia, America may be isolating itself from one of its most important potential allies. Economic ramifications. The economic impact of these sanctions extends far beyond bilateral trade. American companies operating in India face uncertain futures as the business environment becomes increasingly politicized. Indian IT services, pharmaceutical exports, and defense cooperation, all pillars of the bilateral economic relationship, now operate under the shadow of potential sanctions escalation. For India, the sanctions have accelerated efforts to reduce dependence on American technology and financial systems. This includes investments in domestic semiconductor manufacturing, alternative payment systems, and strengthened ties with European and Asian partners. The long-term consequence may be the emergence of a more economically independent India that is less susceptible to American pressure. The broader implications. The sanctions on India represent more than a bilateral dispute. They signal a fundamental shift in how America conducts international relations. The United States increasingly views neutrality as hostility and strategic autonomy as betrayal. This zero-sum approach is reshaping global alliances and forcing countries to make stark choices about their international partnerships. America is increasingly using sanctions as a geopolitical tool against its rivals, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. These countries are important partners for India, which needs to find ways around unilateral American sanctions. This dynamic illustrates how America's sanctions-heavy foreign policy is creating new forms of resistance and cooperation among targeted nations. Looking forward, the shocking truth behind America's sanctions on India is that they represent a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. By treating one of the world's most important emerging powers as a subordinate rather than a partner, the United States has undermined its own long-term interests in favor of short-term pressure tactics. The sanctions have revealed the limits of American financial power in a multipolar world. Countries like India, with significant economic heft and alternative partnerships, can increasingly resist American coercion. This resistance, in turn, is accelerating the development of parallel financial and economic systems that could eventually challenge American global dominance. As this crisis unfolds, it may mark a turning point in the post-Cold War international order. The days when America could dictate terms to even its closest partners may be coming to an end, replaced by a more complex world where strategic autonomy and sovereign decision-making reassert themselves against hegemonic pressure. The true shock lies not in the sanctions themselves, but in what they reveal about America's declining ability to build consensus and its increasing reliance on coercion. In trying to force India's compliance, the United States may have accelerated the very multipolar world it seeks to prevent.